He did not throw her out in secret. At exactly 11:47 that night, outside the glowing iron gates of the Whitman mansion, Preston Whitman, 36-year-old husband of Grace Whitman and the proud founder of Whitman Strategic, ordered security to lock out his own wife, Grace Whitman, 31-year-old pregnant wife of Preston Whitman, while she was 7 months pregnant. Grace sat on the cold stone driveway with one small suitcase, one ultrasound envelope, and a trembling hand pressed against her stomach. Her phone had been taken. Her bank cards had already been blocked. Her gate access had been erased minutes earlier from the estate's security system. Behind the gate, Preston stood beside Sabrina Vale, 31-year-old mistress of Preston Whitman, the woman who had spent months trying to take Grace's place in his company, his mansion, and his life. Sabrina smiled as if the night belonged to her. Near the front steps stood Vivian Whitman, 62-year-old mother of Preston Whitman and mother-in-law of Grace Whitman, the family matriarch who had never accepted Grace because she believed Grace came from ordinary blood. Vivian looked down at her pregnant daughter-in-law and said, "Let her stay there. Maybe the cold will teach her where women like her belong." Preston added, "You came into my life with nothing, Grace. Tonight, you leave with nothing." But what none of them knew was that Grace carried a secret even she did not fully understand, a secret tied to the old brass medallion hanging from her hospital bag, the same medallion her late mother had warned her never to lose. Then an old yellow taxi stopped near the private road. The driver stepped out slowly. He was Arthur Bell, 70-year-old old taxi driver and unknown grandfather of Grace Whitman, though no one behind that gate recognized him. To them, he was just a tired old taxi driver in a faded coat. Preston laughed. Perfect, a poor driver for a poor wife. But Arthur Bell was not poor. He was the billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, the same investment empire Preston had been begging to save his company. Arthur had come near the mansion that night because Bell Meridian's due diligence team had already warned him that Preston's private behavior did not match his polished public image. Arthur had expected arrogance. He had not expected to find a pregnant woman abandoned outside the gate. And when Arthur saw Grace's medallion, then heard her whisper her mother's hidden name, his face changed. Because the woman Preston had just thrown away was Arthur's lost granddaughter. By morning, Preston would learn he had thrown away the one woman who could have saved his name, his company, and his future. This is not just a story about a pregnant wife abandoned outside a mansion. It is a story about a cruel husband who mistook silence for weakness, a mistress who celebrated another woman's pain, a mother-in-law who worshipped status, and an old taxi driver who carried a secret powerful enough to bring an empire to its knees. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you have ever seen someone mocked because people thought they had no power, this story is for you. Subscribe now, stand with Grace, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because tonight, the woman they left outside the gate is about to become the reason they lose everything. The folder slipped from Grace Whitman's hand, and for one terrifying second, she thought the baby had stopped moving. Grace Whitman, a 31-year-old pregnant wife and former financial compliance analyst, stood frozen in the half-painted nursery of the Whitman mansion. She was 7 months pregnant, married to Preston Whitman, and carrying the child everyone in that house claimed to love, but no one seemed willing to protect. Her breath caught in her throat. One hand went to the side of her stomach. The other gripped the edge of the white crib that had not yet been assembled. The room was warm with afternoon light, but Grace suddenly felt cold. "Please," she whispered, "move for me." For 2 painful seconds, nothing happened. Then a small kick pressed against her palm. Grace closed her eyes. Relief almost broke her. On the floor near her feet lay 2 things that did not belong together: soft paint samples for the baby's room and a thick financial risk report for Preston's company. One showed the future she was trying to build. The other showed the danger her husband refused to see. Grace bent slowly and picked up the report. She had marked 3 pages in red. The numbers were not right. Whitman's strategic was promising investors more growth than the supporting records could prove. It was not a harmless mistake. If Bell Meridian reviewed the raw data, they could call it misleading. Grace knew that because she had spent years reading financial statements, other people tried to decorate. She wanted to believe Preston would listen. She always wanted to believe that. Preston Whitman, her 36-year-old husband and the founder of Whitman Strategic, entered the nursery while speaking to the woman beside him. Preston was handsome, polished, and dressed like every room belonged to him. To the public, he was a self-made success. To Grace, he was the man she had once helped rescue from failure. Beside him stood Sabrina Vale, a 31-year-old brand strategist and Preston's mistress, though Grace had never been allowed to say that word out loud. Sabrina mattered in this moment because she was no longer hiding outside Grace's marriage. She was standing inside the nursery, holding a tablet, looking around like she had the right to approve the baby's future. Preston barely looked at Grace. "Did you review the investor memo?" he asked. Grace held the report against her chest. "Yes, there's a problem on page 12. The revenue projection is too high. If Bell Meridian checks the supporting numbers, they may see it as misleading." For a moment, Preston said nothing. Grace knew that look. It was not confusion. It was pride being wounded. "I asked for notes," he said, "not panic." "I'm not panicking," Grace said gently. "I'm trying to protect you." Sabrina smiled before Preston could answer. "That is exactly why I told Preston the memo should come from someone with a cleaner public image," Sabrina said. "Investors do not want a pregnant wife correcting numbers from a nursery." The words landed softly, but they cut deep. Grace did not raise her voice. She had learned that anger in that mansion was dangerous. If she cried, she was unstable. If she argued, she was disrespectful. If she stayed silent, they called it proof that she knew her place. So she swallowed the pain and looked down at the paint samples. Preston took the report from her hand and flipped through the marked pages. He did not thank her. He only sighed, as if her intelligence had become an inconvenience. Then Vivian Whitman entered. Vivian Whitman, Preston's 62-year-old mother and the proud matriarch of the Whitman family, was the person who controlled the mood of the mansion. She mattered because Preston often became cruelest after she gave him permission with a look. Vivian's eyes moved from the unfinished crib to the pale yellow wall. "This color is too plain," she said. "If the child carries the Whitman name, the room should look like legacy, not discount hope." Grace's fingers tightened around the paint card. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who had worked in the Whitman mansion for 8 years, stood near the doorway with folded towels. Mara mattered because she saw what everyone else pretended not to see. She noticed Grace's face fall. She noticed Preston did nothing. She noticed Sabrina's smile. Grace looked at the walls and forced herself to breathe. Years earlier, there had been no mansion, no staff, no investors, no Sabrina. Only a small rented office with flickering lights, a broken printer, and Preston sitting at a cheap desk with his head in his hands. In that memory, Grace was still using the name Grace Harper at work, still proud of the life she was building, and still foolish enough to believe love and loyalty always returned to the person who gave them first. Preston's first investor had pulled out. His numbers were wrong. His pitch was weak. He had looked at her like a man drowning. "I'm finished," he had said. Grace had stayed awake the whole night beside him. She rewrote the risk section, corrected the financial model, and found the accounting error that would have destroyed his pitch. By morning, Preston was smiling again. He had held her hand across that ugly little desk and said, "When this company becomes something, your name will be part of it." Back in the nursery, Grace looked at the report in Preston's hand. Her name was not part of anything now. Sabrina stepped closer to the crib box. "I can help choose a better color," she said. something refined. Grace bent to pick up the folder that had fallen earlier. As she did, a small brass medallion slipped from the side pocket of her hospital bag and hit the floor with a clear, sharp sound. Everyone looked down. The medallion was old and scratched, shaped like a taxi wheel with tiny initials engraved on the back. "IB." Sabrina laughed. "What is that? Some poor family charm." Grace picked it up quickly. "It belonged to my mother." Vivian's mouth curved. "That explains everything." Grace closed her fist around the medallion. She did not know why her mother had kept it. She only remembered one thing her mother once said: "If you are ever truly lost, look for the man who started with a taxi and built a kingdom." At the time, Grace thought it was one of her mother's fevered riddles. Now, with Bell Meridian's name circling Preston's company and a taxi wheel in her palm, the sentence felt less like a memory and more like a warning. That night, after the mansion went quiet, Grace passed Preston's open laptop in his study. An email preview flashed across the screen. "Post-nuptial agreement must be signed before delivery." Grace stopped breathing, because she had never heard of any post-nuptial agreement. And somewhere inside her hospital bag, the little brass taxi medallion felt heavier than before. Grace Whitman almost dropped the glass when she saw another woman sitting in her chair. The cold dining room suddenly felt smaller. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife of Preston Whitman, stopped at the entrance of the long marble dining room with one hand resting protectively on her stomach. Her heart beat hard enough to make her dizzy. Because Sabrina Vale was sitting beside her husband. Not near him. Beside him. In Grace's seat. Sabrina Vale, the 31-year-old brand strategist secretly involved with Preston, sat comfortably at the headside of the table wearing a soft cream-colored dress that looked expensive without trying too hard. Her handbag rested on Grace's usual chair. Her tablet sat beside Preston's breakfast plate. A stack of investor invitations was spread neatly in front of her like she already belonged there. And Preston had allowed it. Grace looked at him. He did not move the bag. He did not tell Sabrina to get up. He did not even look uncomfortable. That hurt more than if he had shouted at her. Vivian Whitman, Preston's 62-year-old mother and the woman who controlled the emotional temperature of the mansion, slowly lifted her coffee cup while watching Grace carefully. Vivian mattered in this moment because she enjoyed seeing whether Grace would break quietly or publicly. The room waited. Grace could feel it. One wrong reaction, and they would use it against her. So instead of fighting, Grace quietly walked to the other end of the table and sat down alone. The silence that followed was crueler than an argument. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who had witnessed years of quiet tension inside the mansion, stepped forward to pour water into Grace's glass. Mara's eyes briefly met Grace. Sympathy flashed there for only a second before Mara lowered her head again. Sabrina smiled politely. "We're discussing the investor reception next week," she said. "The guest list needs refinement." Grace nodded once. "I already reviewed most of the investor files." Sabrina gave a soft laugh. "That may not be the best idea anymore." Grace looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Pregnancy changes energy," Sabrina said smoothly. "Investors prefer calm confidence, not emotional unpredictability." The insult slid across the table like ice. Grace looked at Preston, waiting for him to stop it. Instead, Preston reached for his coffee. Preston Whitman, the 36-year-old founder of Whitman Strategic and Grace's husband, looked tired but controlled. He mattered because every person in that room followed his emotional permission. If he protected Grace, the atmosphere changed. If he stayed silent, cruelty became acceptable. And Preston stayed silent. Then he said, "Maybe Sabrina is right. You should rest more." Grace stared at him. "I helped prepare those investor files." Preston shrugged slightly. "You reviewed old numbers. That isn't the same as building the company." The words hit harder than he realized. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. For a second, Grace forgot how to breathe. Because years earlier, before the mansion, before the investors, before the expensive suits and polished speeches, there had only been two exhausted people trying to survive. A memory pulled her backward. A tiny office. Broken blinds. Cold pizza on a desk. Preston sitting with his head in his hands after losing his first investor. Grace sitting beside him all night correcting spreadsheets while rain hit the windows outside. At 4 in the morning, she had found the accounting mistake that saved his pitch. Preston had grabbed her hand and kissed it. "You saved me," he whispered. Now the same man looked at her like she had only reviewed paperwork. Grace lowered her eyes to hide the pain. Then the dining room doors opened. Derek Shaw, a 41-year-old chief financial officer working under Preston at Whitman Strategic, entered carrying several folders against his chest. Derek mattered because he knew the company's real financial condition, including secrets Preston desperately wanted hidden. Derek looked nervous the moment he stepped inside. His tie sat crooked, sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. "Morning, Mrs. Whitman," he said, then glanced too quickly at one of the folders in his hand. "I'm sorry, I brought the Bell file." Preston's face sharpened immediately. "What Bell file?" Derek swallowed hard. "Bell Meridian's due diligence request. They want deeper backup on the growth projections and any personal legal risk involving senior leadership before they release the next funding letter." The room froze in a different way now. Grace felt Preston's anger before he spoke. Sabrina moved quickly. Too quickly. She reached for one of the folders. "That can wait until after breakfast." But Derek held the folder tighter. "I'm sorry," he said. "Their team marked it urgent." Grace watched the exchange carefully. Bell Meridian Holdings had been mentioned in that house for months. Preston needed their money. Sabrina needed their approval. Vivian worshipped their name because Bell Meridian represented the kind of old power she respected. But Grace's attention stayed on the word Bell. Bell. Her fingers slowly tightened around the edge of the table. Another memory rose inside her. A small kitchen years ago. Her mother coughing into a napkin while evening sunlight touched the cracked counter. Lillian Harper, Grace's late mother, slid the brass taxi medallion across the table toward her daughter. Lillian mattered because everything Grace did not know about herself began with the secrets her mother had been too afraid to explain. "There are names people steal from you," Lillian said softly, "and names heaven returns." Young Grace frowned. Was Harper stolen? Lillian smiled sadly. "Harper kept us safe." Before Grace could ask what that meant, her mother had changed the subject. Back in the dining room, Grace touched the medallion hidden inside her cardigan pocket. Bell. Why did that name suddenly feel familiar? Preston stood up abruptly. "We're wasting time," he said coldly. "Derek, bring the files to my office." Sabrina stood beside him immediately, close enough for their shoulders to touch naturally. Grace noticed it. Vivian noticed Grace noticing it. And Vivian smiled. An hour later, Grace sat alone in a maternity clinic waiting room for a routine checkup. The room smelled like hand sanitizer and baby powder. She pulled out her bank card to pay for the appointment. The receptionist frowned. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitman, the card was declined." Grace forced a smile. "Try again." The receptionist did. "Declined." A cold feeling spread through Grace's stomach. She stepped aside quickly and called the bank from her phone. After several long seconds, a calm voice answered. "Mrs. Whitman, Your authorized access was removed from the account 3 days ago. Grace went completely still. Removed by who? Your husband, Preston Whitman, as primary account holder. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. 3 days ago. Before the email. Before the dining room humiliation. Before this morning. Preston had already started cutting her out. Grace tried her personal savings card next. That one worked. Barely. But when the receipt printed, she saw the remaining balance and understood something colder. Over the past month, Preston had moved nearly every shared payment away from accounts she could access. It was not a mistake. It was preparation. Then a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Oh, Grace." Grace turned slowly. Sabrina Vale stood in the clinic lobby, holding white flowers and smiling softly. "Did he forget to tell you?" Sabrina asked. Grace looked at the flowers. They were not for kindness. They were for performance. Sabrina stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You should really start cooperating. Stress is bad for the baby." And for the first time, Grace realized this was not a marriage falling apart. It was a plan being carried out step by step. As Sabrina's smile widened, Grace remembered the Bell Meridian folder, the postnuptial email, the blocked account, and her mother's strange warning about a man who started with taxis. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something old and buried began to wake up. Grace Whitman stopped walking when she saw her own wedding memory standing across the ballroom. For one painful second, she thought she could not breathe. The grand reception hall inside the Whitman mansion glowed with soft golden light. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished floors. White flowers covered every table. A string quartet played quietly in the corner while wealthy investors laughed over expensive wine. And in the center of it all stood Sabrina Vale. Sabrina Vale, the 31-year-old brand strategist secretly involved with Preston Whitman, wore a silver dress almost identical to the one Grace had worn during her wedding rehearsal dinner 3 years earlier. Not similar, almost exact. Grace recognized the cut of the shoulders, the shape of the neckline, even the tiny crystal details near the waist. Preston once told Grace the dress made her look timeless. Now another woman was wearing that memory like a trophy. Grace's chest tightened so suddenly she had to grip the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. Her baby moved sharply inside her stomach as if reacting to her stress. "Breathe," she whispered quietly to herself. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife of Preston Whitman, had spent the entire afternoon trying to convince herself that tonight could still be saved. She believed if she remained calm, if she acted with dignity, Preston might remember the woman who stood beside him before money changed him. But the moment she entered the ballroom, she understood something terrible. This night had already been arranged against her. Vivian Whitman, Preston's 62-year-old mother and the social ruler of the Whitman family, approached Grace with a thin smile. "You're late," Vivian said, though Grace was exactly on time. Grace looked toward the main table. Her stomach dropped. The seating chart placed Sabrina directly beside Preston. Grace's own name sat near the hallway beside 2 junior employees who looked nervous even being there. A public demotion. Vivian noticed Grace staring at the chart. "A woman should not confuse marriage with importance," she said coldly. Grace forced herself to answer calmly. "I never did." But inside, something cracked quietly. Across the room, Preston Whitman, the 36-year-old founder of Whitman Strategic and Grace's husband, stood speaking confidently with investors near the Bell Meridian display wall. He looked polished, powerful, and completely comfortable beside Sabrina. Like this arrangement no longer embarrassed him. That hurt most of all. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who understood far more than the family realized, passed by carrying fresh glasses for the servers. She slowed for only a second near Grace. "You should sit down, ma'am," Mara whispered gently. "You look pale." Grace nodded, grateful for even that small kindness. Then the music softened as Preston walked toward the stage area prepared for speeches. The room quieted immediately. Preston smiled at the investors. "When I started Whitman Strategic," he began, "I built it from nothing." Grace felt the words hit her like a slap. Nothing. Her mind pulled backward before she could stop it. A freezing winter night, years earlier. Preston asleep at a desk inside their tiny rented office. Grace wrapped in a blanket on the floor beside stacks of financial reports. She had used almost her entire savings account to keep payroll alive during the company's first audit. Another memory. Grace sitting beside Preston before his first major investor meeting, rewriting his compliance presentation because his numbers did not match the regulations. Another memory. Preston holding her face with both hands afterward. "We did it," he whispered. "We built this together." Back in the ballroom, Grace stared at him in silence. Now he was telling the world he built everything alone. The investors applauded. Then Sabrina lifted her champagne glass. "To Preston," she said smoothly, "proof that a man rises faster when he stops carrying unnecessary weight." A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. But Preston did not stop her. He smiled. Grace felt every eye in the room slide toward her for a brief, humiliating second. Still, she refused to cry. She stood carefully and walked toward the hallway before anyone could see how badly her hands were shaking. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter. Cool air touched her face. Grace pressed one hand against her stomach and closed her eyes. She remembered another moment from years ago. Her mother, Lillian Harper, sitting by a window during a thunderstorm, coughing weakly into a cloth while polishing the brass taxi medallion. "There are two kinds of people," Lillian once told her softly, "the ones who forget who carried them and the ones who remember every sacrifice." Grace swallowed hard. She had remembered every sacrifice. Why had Preston forgotten? Footsteps approached quickly behind her. Derek Shaw, the 41-year-old chief financial officer of Whitman Strategic, stepped into the hallway, clutching several folders tightly against his chest. Derek mattered because he knew secrets about Preston's company that could destroy everything. He looked nervous enough to be sick. "Grace," he whispered urgently. Grace looked up. Derek glanced toward the ballroom before speaking again. "Do not sign anything Preston gives you." Grace frowned. "What?" "Especially not before the baby comes." Fear crawled slowly through her chest. "What are you talking about?" Derek opened one of the folders slightly, as if about to show her something. Grace saw only 3 words before he snapped it halfway shut. "After Grace signs." Her blood went cold. Before Derek could explain, a calm voice interrupted from the hallway entrance. "Is there a private meeting I wasn't invited to?" Sabrina stood there smiling. But her eyes were sharp. Dangerously sharp. Derek immediately closed the folder. Grace noticed his hands trembling. Then her eyes drifted past Sabrina toward the massive digital investor display mounted against the ballroom wall. The Bell Meridian Holdings logo rotated slowly across the screen. A silver wheel shape. Elegant, modern, but unmistakably familiar. Grace's hand slowly moved toward the brass medallion hidden inside her purse. The shapes were almost the same. Her pulse quickened. Before she could think further, Sabrina stepped closer and gently fixed Preston's tie as he entered the hallway behind her. The gesture looked intimate, practiced, possessive, and Preston did not move away. Much later that night, after the guests had gone home and the mansion fell quiet, Grace sat alone on the edge of her bed removing earrings with shaking fingers. Then she noticed something inside her purse. A folded dinner napkin. She frowned and opened it carefully. A small black flash drive fell into her hand. A white label had been attached to it. Grace stared at the handwritten words. After Grace signs, her hands went cold. Derek had not finished warning her, so he had given her the proof. And somewhere downstairs in the dark mansion, a door closed softly. Grace Whitman nearly screamed when the folder opened. Her hands shook so badly that the flash drive almost slipped from her fingers. The nursery was dark, except for one small lamp near the unfinished crib. Half-painted walls glowed pale gold in the weak light. Tiny baby clothes sat folded beside stacks of company documents. The room looked like two different lives trapped together, motherhood and betrayal. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife of Preston Whitman, sat alone on the nursery floor with Preston's laptop open in front of her. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Because the flash drive was not random. It was organized, planned, careful, cruel. The label still sat beside the computer. After Grace signs, Grace clicked the first folder. Postnup drafts. Legal documents filled the screen. Her breath caught. The mansion. Company shares. Future profits. Investment earnings. Everything was being rewritten as Preston's separate property. The agreement even stated that Grace accepted a small monthly allowance for the benefit of marital peace and waived any claim to business value created before or during the marriage. Grace stared at the phrase, marital peace. They were using beautiful words to hide a cage. If Grace signed the postnuptial agreement, she would lose almost everything before her baby was even born. Her chest tightened painfully. "This can't be real," she whispered. But deep inside, she already knew it was. She opened the second folder. Public narratives. This time, Sabrina's name appeared repeatedly inside the notes. Grace felt cold all over. The documents did not call her sick directly. They were smarter than that. They described her as emotionally unstable, overly sensitive, irrational during pregnancy, and unable to handle important business decisions. Draft statements suggested Preston was protecting his wife from pressure while privately moving her away from the company. Some notes even suggested Preston should encourage her to rest away from stressful environments before the baby arrived. Grace stared at the words in disbelief. They were building a story around her. Not a marriage. A case. Her hands slowly moved to her stomach protectively. The baby kicked once. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm trying," she whispered softly. "I'm trying to protect us." Then she opened the third folder. Vendor transfers. Rows of payment records appeared across the screen. Whitman Strategic had transferred huge amounts of money to consulting companies connected to Sabrina Vale. Grace recognized several dates immediately. One payment happened the same week Preston told her the company needed budget cuts, forcing her to stop using the small consulting account she used for compliance review. Another payment happened the exact day her shared bank access disappeared. This was not emotional betrayal anymore. This was financial warfare. Then Grace opened the fourth folder. And suddenly, she understood everything. Bell Meridian Risk. The document contained internal warnings from Whitman Strategic's legal department. Bell Meridian Holdings, the powerful investment group Preston desperately needed, could withdraw support if there was evidence of domestic scandal, financial misrepresentation, leadership instability, or public controversy involving senior executives. Grace stared at the screen. Finally, the truth became clear. Preston was not only cheating on her. He was trying to silence her before the baby came, because scandal could destroy his business expansion. His cruelty was not careless. It was strategic. A tear slid down Grace's face before she quickly wiped it away. Not because she was weak, because she suddenly understood how long this had been happening behind her back. Flashbacks crashed into her mind, one after another. Preston telling her she should rest more while secretly removing her financial access. Sabrina taking over investor meetings while calling Grace emotional. Vivian constantly reminding her that she married into the Whitman family. Every insult suddenly connected. They were preparing to erase her long before she noticed. Grace quickly reached for the printer beside the nursery shelf. The machine hummed softly as pages slowly began printing. She needed proof. Real proof. Her fingers moved urgently through the folders while the printer continued spitting out documents. Then footsteps echoed sharply outside the nursery. Grace froze. The nursery door swung open. Preston Whitman entered first. Behind him came Sabrina Vale. And behind Sabrina stood Vivian Whitman. All three together. Like a team. Preston immediately saw the open laptop. His face darkened instantly. For one dangerous second, nobody moved. Then Sabrina reacted first. Fast. Too fast. She crossed the room, grabbed the flash drive from beside the computer, and slipped it into her clutch purse before Grace could even stand. Grace's body tensed instinctively. But she stopped herself. If she lunged for the drive, they would call her unstable. Exactly like the files planned. Preston stepped toward her slowly. He placed a thick document folder onto the nursery floor in front of her. The post-nuptial agreement. Sign it, he said coldly. Grace looked up at him. No. Vivian gave a sharp laugh. You came into this family with nothing, she said. Do not pretend pregnancy suddenly made you valuable. The words landed hard. But Sabrina were worse. Preston needs a partner, Grace, Sabrina said smoothly, not a burden in maternity clothes. Grace looked at Preston. She waited. Waited for him to deny it. Waited for him to stop this. But Preston only stared down at her with tired irritation. Like she had become an obstacle. You have until tomorrow night, he said. After that, things become difficult. Grace slowly stood, despite the ache in her back. The room spun slightly from stress, but she forced herself to remain steady. Then she finally said the one thing none of them expected. You're afraid of what I know. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Preston's jaw tightened. That sentence hit him. Grace saw it. For the first time all night, his confidence cracked. He stepped closer until his voice became low and sharp. No, he said quietly, I'm tired of pretending you matter. The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Grace felt something break inside her. Not love. Illusion. Suddenly, she remembered her mother sitting beside a window years ago, gently brushing Grace's hair while speaking softly. When someone tries to make you feel small, Lillian Harper once said, listen carefully, they usually saw something big in you first. As a child, Grace never understood that sentence. Now she finally did. Preston wanted her powerless because he feared what happened if she stopped being powerless. Sabrina smirked slightly and turned toward the door. Vivian followed. Preston gave Grace one final look before leaving the nursery behind them. The door slammed shut. Silence filled the room again. Grace stood motionless for several seconds. Then something caught her attention. The printer. It had stopped halfway through the final page. Preston had taken the flash drive, but he had not looked under the nursery shelf. A few printed pages had slid into the lower output tray behind a folded drop cloth left by the painters. From the doorway, they were almost invisible. Grace moved slowly, carefully, and pulled them free. Only 7 pages. Not everything, but enough to prove there had been a plan. Then she noticed a tiny blinking red light near the nursery shelf. The camera. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who had supervised workers repainting the nursery earlier that week, had turned the nursery camera on to monitor the contractors because the mansion had recently suffered a theft during renovations. Grace looked toward the camera. It would not show every file. It would not capture every number. But it had captured Preston forcing the post-nup. It had captured Sabrina taking the flash drive. It had captured Vivian's words. Her breathing changed. Hope. Tiny. Dangerous. But real. Grace folded the 7 pages and hid them inside the cardboard sleeve of the unassembled crib manual. Then she whispered into the empty room. Maybe you didn't take everything. And somewhere downstairs, she heard Sabrina laughing softly. The sound of breaking glass silenced the entire party. Grace Whitman stood frozen in the middle of the grand ballroom, while champagne spread across the marble floor near her feet. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward her. At the front of the room, Preston Whitman slowly lowered his glass with cold anger in his eyes. Beside him stood Sabrina Vale, with one hand resting possessively on his arm. Grace's chest rose sharply with panic, because she finally understood. This was not a marriage falling apart anymore. This was an execution. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife of Preston Whitman, had come downstairs tonight hoping for one last private conversation with her husband before things became impossible to fix. She wanted to protect her baby, protect her future, protect whatever remained of the man she once loved. Instead, she walked into a celebration that looked like her replacement ceremony. The mansion glowed with warm light. Wealthy investors and social friends filled the rooms holding crystal glasses while soft music played in the background. But the warmth felt fake. Sabrina stood beside Preston like she already owned the house. She greeted guests before Grace could. Accepted compliments meant for the hostess. Touched Preston's tie. Whispered into his ear while guests watched openly. And Preston allowed all of it. Vivian Whitman, Preston's 62-year-old mother and the cruel protector of the Whitman family image, moved through the party spreading poison disguised as concern. She's been difficult lately, Vivian quietly told guests while glancing toward Grace. Pregnancy affects some women more than others. Grace heard every word. The humiliation was no longer hidden. It was becoming public. Then Preston approached her in front of everyone. His smile looked calm, but his eyes did not. "Come with me," he said quietly. Fear moved through Grace immediately. Because Preston only sounded that controlled when he was angry enough to become dangerous. The foyer felt colder than the ballroom. Sabrina followed behind them. So did Vivian. Grace noticed that instantly. This was coordinated. Preston closed the foyer doors behind them and pulled a thick folder from the table. The post-nuptial agreement. "Again. Sign it now," he said flatly, "or leave." Grace stared at him. "You're still doing this." I'm done asking politely. Grace held her stomach protectively. I'm your wife. Sabrina laughed softly. Legally, she corrected. Vivian crossed her arms. You should have signed yesterday instead of snooping through private files. Grace's heart jumped. They knew she had opened the flash drive. Preston stepped closer. You have become a liability, Grace. The word shattered something inside her. Liability. Not wife. Not mother of his child. Liability. Grace looked directly into his eyes. You were planning this long before I found out. For a second, Preston said nothing. That silence confirmed everything. Grace slowly shook her head. I helped build your company. I stood beside you when nobody respected you. Flashbacks crashed painfully through her mind. Preston crying in a tiny office after losing investors. Grace using her salary to save payroll. Preston kissing her forehead and whispering, "You're the reason I keep going." Now that same man looked at her like she was disposable. Sabrina stepped closer. You were useful then, she said coldly, not now. Grace looked at Preston again, waiting desperately for him to deny it. He didn't. Instead, he turned toward the security hallway. Owen Pike, the 38-year-old head security guard responsible for protecting the Whitman estate, appeared almost immediately. Owen mattered because he was about to become part of the moment that destroyed Grace's life. He looked uncomfortable the second he saw Grace's face. Preston spoke without emotion. Disable Mrs. Whitman's gate access. Owen hesitated. Sir. Now. Grace felt her stomach tighten painfully. Owen pulled out the estate security tablet. His fingers paused over the access panel. The screen showed her name. Grace Whitman, resident access. Preston's voice cut through the silence. Remove it. Owen swallowed hard and pressed the command. The screen changed. Access revoked. Grace stared at it. The house had just erased her in one touch. Vivian turned toward Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who had quietly cared about Grace for years. Pack one suitcase, Vivian ordered, only basic items. Mara looked horrified, but she obeyed slowly. Sabrina walked toward the entry table and picked up Grace's phone before slipping it into her purse. Grace moved instinctively. That's mine. But Preston blocked her path. His voice dropped low. You'll only use it to create drama. Grace stared at him in disbelief. I am 7 months pregnant. Preston's face hardened. Then you should have been smarter. The words hit harder than a slap. Grace felt dizzy. Not because she was weak. Because she could not understand how the same man who once kissed her swollen feet after long workdays could now throw her away while she carried his child. Mara returned with one small suitcase and Grace's hospital bag. Her eyes were wet, but Vivian stood too close for her to speak. Grace noticed the ultrasound envelope sticking out from the side pocket. She grabbed the bag immediately. Inside it rested the old brass taxi medallion from her mother. The only thing in that house that had never lied to her. Owen avoided her eyes as he escorted her through the front doors. Cold wind hit Grace immediately. The iron gate stood ahead under soft golden mansion lights. Behind her, the party music started again. Like nothing important had happened. At 11:47 p.m., the gate clicked shut behind her. Locked. Grace stood outside the mansion in silence. Her phone was gone. Her cards were gone. Her gate access was disabled. And over months, Preston had slowly isolated her from almost everyone else, by convincing her to stay quiet about their marriage problems. Now she understood why. Several guests noticed her through the gate. Some whispered. Others openly stared. One woman lifted her phone slightly. Recording. Vivian appeared near the front steps inside the mansion. "Let her stay there," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Maybe the cold will teach her where women like her belong." Sabrina walked outside onto the inner driveway in high heels, holding Grace's second shoe. Then she tossed it carelessly toward the fountain. "Careful, Grace," Sabrina said with a smile. "You're already embarrassing the baby." Preston stood beside Sabrina, his face cold and proud. "You came into my life with nothing, Grace," he said. "Tonight, you leave with nothing." Grace finally sat down because her legs felt weak. One hand held her stomach. The other clutched her hospital bag tightly. The cold stone pressed through her dress. Wind moved softly through the hedges. Then headlights appeared down the private road. A yellow taxi slowly approached the gate. It stopped beside her. Arthur Bell, a 70-year-old former taxi driver secretly living as the hidden billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, stepped out slowly from the driver's seat. To everyone watching, he looked like a tired old man in a worn coat. But Arthur mattered because this moment was about to reconnect him to the family he had lost decades earlier. Arthur still drove that old taxi on certain nights because it was the first cab he ever owned, the one he had used before Bell Meridian became an empire. After his daughter vanished years ago, he kept the cab running as a private ritual, driving through neighborhoods connected to old leads whenever he needed to remember that wealth had once cost him something human. That night, he had also come near the Whitman estate for another reason. Bell Meridian's due diligence team had warned him that Preston Whitman's public image might be too polished to trust. Arthur wanted to see the man's world without cameras, escorts, or boardroom smiles. He had expected arrogance. He had not expected cruelty at the gate. Preston laughed from inside the gate. "Perfect timing," he called out. "Take her anywhere, she's not welcome here." Arthur ignored him completely. Instead, he knelt carefully in front of Grace. His voice was gentle. "Ma'am, do you need a hospital?" Grace swallowed hard. "I just need somewhere safe." Arthur nodded softly. Then his eyes fell toward the brass medallion hanging from her hospital bag. Everything about him changed. His breathing stopped for one terrible second. His hands trembled. He stared at the small taxi wheel symbol like he had seen a ghost. "Where," he whispered carefully, "did you get that?" Grace looked down at the medallion. "It belonged to my mother." Arthur's face slowly lost color. "What was her name?" Grace hesitated. Her mother had used one name in public and buried another one in half-finished sentences. But stress and exhaustion made the truth slip out the way childhood memories sometimes do. "Lillian Harper," Grace whispered. "But once, when she was very sick, she said Harper was only the name that kept her safe." Arthur became very still. Grace looked at him through tears. She said her real name was Lillian Bell. Arthur nearly staggered backward. Because 32 years earlier, his pregnant daughter had disappeared after a brutal family betrayal, and every private investigator he hired had eventually lost her trail under the name Lillian Harper. A memory slammed into him instantly. Young Lillian laughing beside his very first taxi. Arthur placing the brass medallion into her hand. "If you ever get lost," he had told her warmly, "this little wheel will bring you home." Then she vanished months later. And now that same medallion hung from the bag of a pregnant woman, abandoned outside a mansion gate. Arthur looked at Grace differently now. Not like a stranger. Like something precious had suddenly returned from the dead. As he carefully helped Grace toward the taxi, Preston shouted mockingly from behind the gate. "You should thank me, old man. She's nothing but trouble." Arthur slowly turned his head toward the mansion lights. His eyes became very still, very cold. "Men usually say that," he said quietly, "right after they throw away treasure." Preston laughed, but Arthur did not. Grace lowered herself carefully into the back seat of the taxi. Arthur closed the door gently, as if the sound itself might hurt her. Then he looked once more at the glowing Whitman mansion. Not like an old driver, like a man silently measuring how much destruction it could survive. And as the taxi pulled away from the gate, Grace pressed one hand against her stomach, one hand against the medallion, and understood something she could not yet explain. The night Preston threw her away was the night her mother's secret finally found her. Grace Whitman gasped suddenly in the back seat of the taxi, clutching her stomach so hard Arthur Bell almost missed the turn onto the main road. "Are you in pain?" he asked immediately. His voice stayed calm, but his hands tightened around the steering wheel. Grace could barely answer. I don't know." Fear filled the small taxi instantly. The cold shock from the mansion, the stress, the humiliation, the public laughter, the way Preston had spoken to her as if she were already erased, all of it crashed into her body at once. Arthur Bell, the 70-year-old former taxi driver secretly living as the billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, looked at Grace through the rearview mirror with growing emotion he could barely control. He mattered now not only because he was powerful, but because he understood what it meant to lose family after arriving too late. He quickly pulled the taxi to the side of the road. The dashboard light painted tired shadows across his face. "Look at me," he said gently, "slow breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth." Grace tried. Her breathing shook badly. "I can't lose this baby," she whispered. The sentence hit Arthur harder than she realized. Because 32 years earlier, his daughter Lillian had once begged him to listen before she disappeared from his life, and he had been too proud, too angry, and too certain he knew better. Arthur swallowed the old pain. "You are going to the hospital," he said firmly. Grace looked toward the dark road ahead. "I don't have my insurance card. My phone is gone. Preston blocked the accounts." "Then tonight we solve breathing first," Arthur replied. "Money later." The taxi pulled back onto the road. Behind them, the glowing Whitman mansion slowly disappeared into darkness. Grace wrapped Arthur's spare coat tighter around herself. It smelled faintly like old leather, winter air, and peppermint candy. For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Grace looked down at the brass medallion resting against her hospital bag. "My mother used to say strange things about taxis," she whispered weakly. Arthur's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. "What kind of things?" Grace stared out the window. "She said the man who began with taxis wasn't cruel, just late." Arthur almost stopped breathing. Those were Lillian's exact words. "Not similar. Exact." A painful memory struck him instantly. Lillian Bell, his only daughter, standing beside one of his first taxi cabs when she was 22 years old, angry tears running down her face during their final argument. Lillian mattered because every secret now surrounding Grace began with the night Lillian vanished from the Bell family. Arthur had been younger then, harder, obsessed with protecting the Bell name after his taxi business exploded into a private investment empire. "You care more about the Bell name than me," Lillian had shouted. Arthur had shouted back. He told her the man she loved could not be trusted. He told her she was naive. He told her the world used women like her to reach men like him. Weeks later, money disappeared from one of Bell Meridian's private accounts. Forged documents appeared. Lillian was accused by people Arthur had trusted. By the time Arthur discovered the truth, that Lillian had been manipulated by a man working with one of Arthur's own executives. She had already vanished under another name. Lillian Harper. Arthur spent decades searching quietly for her. And now her daughter sat trembling in the back of his taxi. But Arthur forced himself to stay calm. He needed proof. Grace needed safety first. And power used too soon could frighten the very person he was trying to protect. The hospital emergency entrance finally appeared ahead. Arthur parked quickly and came around to help Grace out of the taxi. The bright hospital lights made her look pale and exhausted. Inside, a nurse behind the intake desk immediately noticed Grace holding her stomach. Elaine Porter, a 52-year-old emergency intake nurse responsible for overnight admissions, stepped forward quickly. Elaine mattered because she would become the first official witness proving Grace had arrived abandoned, distressed, and without basic support while heavily pregnant. "How far along are you?" Elaine asked. 7 months, Grace answered quietly. Elaine's expression tightened. "Any recent trauma, stress, fall?" Grace hesitated. Arthur answered carefully. "She was put out of her home tonight." Elaine looked from Grace's swollen feet to the missing shoe and immediately understood enough not to ask further questions in the lobby. "Wheelchair," Elaine called to an orderly. Grace shook her head weakly. "I can walk." Elaine's voice softened but became firm. "Tonight you don't have to prove that." Those words almost broke Grace. Because all night, everyone had forced her to prove she was not weak. For once, someone did not make her strength the price of kindness. As Elaine began the intake paperwork, she asked the question Grace feared most. "Emergency contact." Grace froze. Her husband was the danger. Her mother was dead. Her phone was gone. Most of her old friends had been quietly pushed away after Preston convinced her that private marriages stay private. For one horrible second, Grace realized she had nobody. Arthur quietly slid his taxi license across the counter. "Use mine for tonight." Grace looked at him carefully. Suspicion mixed with exhaustion. Arthur understood immediately. So he also handed over a simple identification card and stepped back from her space. "She stays where nurses can see her," he said gently. "Public room, public staff, you don't have to trust me quickly." That mattered. Because dangerous men usually rush trust. Arthur made room for it instead. Grace slowly nodded. For the first time since the gate closed behind her, she felt slightly safer. An hour later, Grace sat on a hospital bed after the doctor confirmed the baby was stable. Dr. Hannah Price, a 39-year-old obstetric emergency physician assigned to Grace's case, explained that Grace had not gone into labor but needed rest, fluids, and monitoring because extreme stress could put both mother and child at risk. Dr. Price mattered because her medical notes would later prove that Grace's condition was not performance, drama, or manipulation. "The baby's heartbeat is steady," Dr. Price said. Grace covered her mouth. Relief nearly made her cry. Outside the room, Arthur sat alone in the waiting area, staring at the brass medallion through the clear side pocket of Grace's bag. His eyes looked older than before. Another memory surfaced. Lillian laughing while spinning the medallion between her fingers. "If I disappear someday," she joked once, "you'll still find me." Arthur had laughed then. Now the memory felt like punishment. A soft voice interrupted him. "Mr. Bell." Arthur looked up. Claire Monroe, a 45-year-old divorce attorney and longtime legal advisor, connected quietly to Bell Meridian's charitable legal fund, approached carrying a leather folder. Claire mattered because she would become the first person to help Grace fight back legally without treating her like a scandal. Arthur had called her 20 minutes earlier. not as a billionaire calling in a favor to crush someone. As a frightened old man who had found a pregnant woman outside a gate and did not want power to move faster than evidence. Grace looked confused when Claire entered the hospital room. "I can't afford a lawyer," Grace said immediately. Claire sat calmly across from her. "Tonight," she said gently, "you do not have to solve everything. Tonight you only have to stop him from controlling tomorrow." Grace's eyes filled slightly. Nobody had spoken to her like she still mattered in a very long time. Claire opened her folder carefully. "If your husband removed you from accounts, forced legal pressure during pregnancy, took your phone, disabled your home access, and abandoned you outside the marital residence, we begin documenting immediately." Grace swallowed hard. Then Claire asked the most important question yet. "Do you have evidence?" Grace immediately reached for her hospital bag. Her breathing stopped. The printed pages from the nursery were not in the main compartment. She searched again, desperately. Nothing. Panic flooded her chest. No. Then she remembered. The crib manual. The 7 pages. She had hidden them inside the cardboard sleeve before Mara packed the hospital bag. Grace dug deeper and pulled out the folded nursery manual with trembling hands. Inside it were the 7 printed pages. Not everything, but enough. Post-nup language. Vendor transfers. Bell Meridian risk warnings. Public narrative notes. Claire's expression changed the moment she saw them. Arthur leaned forward but said nothing. Claire carefully placed each page into a clear evidence sleeve. "This is a beginning," she said. Grace closed her eyes tightly. Then suddenly, another image flashed into her mind. The blinking nursery camera. The hallway camera near the foyer. Owen's security tablet revoking her access. Grace slowly opened her eyes again. "There may be more," she whispered. Claire looked at her. "Where's?" Grace's voice steadied for the first time. "Inside the mansion." And for the first time since leaving the gate, hope returned beside the fear. Grace Whitman's hands started shaking the moment the video appeared on Claire Monroe's laptop. The sound was muted, but she did not need audio to understand the cruelty. There she was, sitting outside the mansion gate. Pregnant. Alone. One shoe missing. The camera angle made her look unstable instead of abandoned. The caption below the video read, "Whitman CEO's pregnant wife refuses medical help after emotional breakdown." Grace felt sick instantly. "No," she whispered. Her chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. Because she understood exactly what Preston and Sabrina were doing. They were rewriting the story before she could speak. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife Preston Whitman had thrown out of their mansion, sat inside Claire Monroe's law office wearing the same hospital bracelet from the night before. The office was quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the faint city noise outside. Arthur Bell's old yellow taxi remained parked near the sidewalk below like a silent guard. Claire Monroe, the 45-year-old divorce attorney now helping Grace, immediately reached for the laptop. "We expected this," Claire said calmly. But Grace's eyes stayed locked on the video. Comments were already spreading underneath it. "Poor Preston. That woman looks unstable. Why would he throw out his pregnant wife unless something was seriously wrong?" Grace suddenly burst into tears. Not loud tears. Not dramatic tears. The kind that came from humiliation too deep to hold anymore. Arthur Bell, the 70-year-old billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, still allowing Grace to know him only as the old taxi driver who helped her, watched her carefully from across the office. Grace covered her face. "My baby might see this someday." That sentence broke the room open emotionally. Not because Grace cared about strangers online, because she feared her child would one day believe the lies. Arthur slowly placed a glass of water beside her. "You are not the story they're telling," he said quietly. Grace wiped her face slowly. Then she forced herself upright. "No," she whispered, "I'm done letting them tell it for me." That was the moment everything changed. Claire leaned forward immediately. "Good," she said, "because revenge is emotional, evidence is permanent." Grace took a slow breath and started talking. Everything. The nursery camera. The printed pages. Sabrina stealing the flash drive. The post-nuptial agreement. The bank access being removed. The gate access being disabled. Derek warning her not to sign anything. Owen using the security tablet. Vivian ordering Mara to pack only one suitcase. Claire wrote notes rapidly across a yellow legal pad. Every detail mattered. Every detail connected. "This is no longer just infidelity," Claire said carefully. "This is coercion, financial isolation, reputation control, and possible corporate fraud." Grace looked stunned hearing it spoken aloud. Because namming abuse made it real. Claire slid the office phone toward her. "Call Mara." Grace hesitated. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper working inside the Whitman mansion, had always treated Grace with kindness. But Vivian controlled the staff through fear, and Grace knew Preston could ruin people who depended on him for income. Still, Grace called. Mara answered in a whisper. "Mrs. Whitman, please don't call here." Grace heard fear immediately. "Mara." "Mrs. Whitman, Vivian told everyone not to speak to you. They said lawyers may come." Grace closed her eyes briefly. Then she remembered something from a year earlier. Mara's son had needed emergency surgery. Preston refused to approve extended leave forms because he said family problems were not company problems. Grace quietly completed the paperwork herself through Preston's office system, protected Mara's job, and never told anyone. Now she reminded her gently. "I helped your son because it was the right thing to do," Grace said softly. "I'm not asking you to betray anyone. I'm asking you to tell the truth." Long silence. Then Mara started crying quietly. "There's footage," she whispered. Grace's heart jumped. The nursery camera recorded part of what happened with the post-nup. The hallway backup camera caught Mr. Whitman ordering Owen to disable your gate access, and the front exterior camera shows you being locked outside. Claire immediately sat straighter. Mara lowered her voice further. "I copied the files before Vivian ordered everything deleted." Arthur exchanged a quick look with Claire. Now they had proof. Hours later, Mara arrived at the office trembling with fear, carrying a small storage drive hidden inside a tissue box. The footage was worse than Grace remembered. Preston forcing the post-nup. Sabrina grabbing the flash drive. Vivian ordering the suitcase packed. Owen hesitating before revoking Grace's access. The timestamps were visible. The truth was visible. Grace stared silently at the screen while Claire copied everything carefully. Then came the next problem. Owen Pike. Owen Pike, the 38-year-old head security guard who locked Grace outside the mansion gate, refused to cooperate at first when Claire contacted him. Owen mattered because the gate logs could prove Grace had not left voluntarily. "I have a family," he said nervously over speakerphone. "I can't lose my job." Grace took the phone quietly. "You locked me outside because a rich man told you to," she said calmly. "I'm asking you to unlock the truth because your conscience is telling you to." Silence. Long silence. Then Owen exhaled heavily. The gate logs still exist, he admitted quietly. Mr. Whitman disabled your access himself after ordering me to open the security panel. Claire smiled slightly for the first time all day. Another piece connected. That evening, Derek Shaw, the 41-year-old chief financial officer of Whitman Strategic, arrived secretly at Claire's office, carrying several folders. He looked exhausted. "They're going to blame me," he said immediately. Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" Derek opened the folders. Payment records. Internal emails. Vendor contracts. Sabrina and Preston created fake consulting companies before the divorce planning started, Derek explained. Money was moved through them quietly. If Bell Meridian investigates, Preston intends to make it look like I approved everything alone. Grace felt cold again. Sabrina had not simply stolen her marriage. She had helped build the trap. Derek pointed toward one email chain. "This is why I gave you the flash drive. I was scared. I should have come sooner." Grace looked at him. For a moment, anger rose. He had known. He had waited. But then she saw the fear in his face and understood something painful. Preston had not only trapped her. He had built a company where everyone was afraid to tell the truth until the danger reached them too. Claire took the folders. "We'll verify every file before using it," she said. "No shortcuts." That mattered, because Grace was not going to win by becoming Preston. Meanwhile, across town inside the Whitman mansion, Sabrina sat beside Preston while Vivian reviewed the growing online reactions to the gate video. Sabrina smiled coldly. "The public believes polished people," she said, "not abandoned women." Vivian nodded approvingly. Preston looked relieved for the first time in days. He still believed he controlled the narrative. Back inside Claire's office, Arthur slowly placed the brass medallion onto the table in front of Grace. His expression looked heavier now. "Grace," he said carefully, "did your mother ever mention the name Bell?" Grace looked at the medallion. Then far away. "She only said it once." Arthur stayed very still. Grace swallowed hard. "She said Bell was the name she couldn't keep." A painful memory surfaced instantly. Young Grace watching her mother burn old letters in a kitchen sink. One envelope carried the same wheel-shaped crest as the medallion. "Are we hiding?" little Grace had asked. Lillian smiled sadly through tears. "No, sweetheart, we are surviving until truth is safe." Arthur's eyes darkened with emotion. Then his phone rang. Everyone looked up. Arthur answered quietly. A man's voice spoke urgently through the speaker. "Mr. Bell, the hospital birth record search came back. Lillian Harper gave birth to a daughter named Grace. No father listed. The dates match. The birth location matches the last confirmed lead on Lillian Bell." Grace stared at Arthur. "Mr. Bell." The words entered her slowly. Not because she had never heard the name. Because suddenly, the old taxi driver was no longer only an old taxi driver. Arthur slowly lowered the phone. The room went silent. Grace looked at the medallion. Then at him. "What are you not telling me?" Arthur's face broke with emotion he had carried for decades. "I think," he whispered, "you may be my granddaughter." Grace stopped breathing. And for the first time since the mansion gate closed behind her, she realized her mother had not only hidden from danger. She had hidden Grace inside a life small enough that powerful enemies would stop looking. The room exploded into whispers the moment Grace Whitman walked back into the mansion. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died instantly. Even the soft music near the investor screens suddenly felt too loud. Because the woman, Preston Whitman, publicly humiliated outside his gate, had just returned. And she did not look broken. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife Preston tried to erase, stepped into the grand reception hall with one hand resting calmly against her stomach. She wore a simple dark dress instead of the expensive gowns Vivian always forced her to wear at events. Her face looked tired but steady. For the first time in months, Grace was not walking into the mansion to beg for peace. She was walking in with proof. Behind her walked Claire Monroe, the 45-year-old divorce attorney helping Grace fight Preston legally. Claire carried a leather folder under one arm and moved with calm confidence. Beside Claire stood Nathan Cole, a 50-year-old licensed process server responsible for officially delivering court filings. Nathan mattered because his presence made the situation real in a way Preston could not dismiss as emotion. Across the room, Preston Whitman froze. Then his expression hardened immediately. Preston Whitman, the 36-year-old founder of Whitman Strategic, had organized tonight's emergency investor reception to repair his image after the gate video began circulating online. He believed if investors saw him smiling beside Sabrina, the public would forget the woman abandoned outside his gate. Sabrina Vale, the 31-year-old mistress helping Preston manipulate both the company and the narrative around Grace, stood beside him dressed in white like she already belonged in Grace's place permanently. Vivian Whitman moved quickly toward nearby guests the second Grace entered. "She shouldn't be here," Vivian whispered sharply. "She's emotionally unstable right now." Grace heard it. But this time, she did not shrink. Bell Meridian logos glowed across giant presentation screens around the ballroom, while wealthy investors watched the tension unfold carefully. Preston forced a smile. "Grace," he said loudly enough for guests to hear, "this isn't the right place for emotional scenes." Claire answered before Grace could. "We're not here for a scene, Mr. Whitman." Nathan stepped forward immediately. "And neither is this." He handed Preston the legal packet. The room went completely silent. Preston opened the first page. His face changed. Then the second. Then the third. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Emergency motion for financial protection. Asset preservation request. Notice of evidence preservation. Request for immediate return of personal property. The investors exchanged nervous looks instantly. Grace watched Preston carefully. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Then he laughed suddenly. Too loudly. Too quickly. "You hired a lawyer with what money?" he asked mockingly. Grace almost answered. But another voice entered first. "You should worry less about her money," the voice said quietly, "and more about your own." Everyone turned. Arthur Bell stepped into the ballroom, still wearing the same old taxi driver coat. Several guests frowned in confusion. Preston smirked immediately. "You again," he laughed. "Did she pay you in sympathy?" Arthur said nothing at first. Slowly, calmly, he removed his cap. Derek Shaw, the 41-year-old chief financial officer who secretly helped Grace gather evidence against Preston, reacted first. His entire face drained of color. "Oh my God," Derek whispered. One investor stood up suddenly. Then another. A gray-haired investor near the Bell Meridian presentation screens stared openly. "That's Arthur Bell." The entire room shifted instantly. Because everybody knew the name. Arthur Bell, the billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings. The man Preston desperately needed approval from. The same old taxi driver Preston mocked outside the gate. Preston's smile disappeared. Completely. Arthur walked slowly toward the center of the room while every investor watched. Grace studied him quietly. Even now, Arthur did not look proud. He looked sad. Bell Meridian Holdings, Arthur said calmly, has reviewed serious concerns regarding Whitman Strategic's leadership, domestic conduct, and financial reporting. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Preston's face turned pale. Sabrina leaned closer immediately and whispered urgently, "Preston, fix this." But Preston had no idea how. Because for the first time in his life, money could not control the room anymore. Arthur looked briefly toward Grace before speaking again. "And there is another matter." Vivian stiffened instantly. Arthur's voice lowered slightly. "The woman Mr. Whitman publicly described as having no family may be the surviving child of my daughter, Lillian Bell." The room froze. Actually froze. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. The investors stared openly now. Several people looked at Grace differently immediately. Not with pity anymore. With shock. Vivian's face lost all color. Just days earlier, she mocked Grace's background repeatedly. She called her ordinary, low-class, disposable. Now the same woman might be connected by blood to the very billionaire family Preston had spent months trying to impress. Grace looked toward Arthur slowly. Her mind spun painfully. Lillian Bell. Not only Harper. Bell. Flashbacks hit her instantly. Her mother burning old letters. The taxi medallion. The wheel-shaped crest. The sentence, "Bell was the name I could not keep." Arthur spoke carefully again. "I am not announcing this as final legal fact tonight. Confirmation still requires court-accepted documentation and DNA verification." That mattered, because Arthur refused to manipulate truth the way Preston did. Even now, he protected Grace carefully. Preston looked physically shaken. Not because he suddenly cared about Grace. Because he realized what he had done. He threw away the possible heir to the Bell family while begging Bell Meridian for investment support. And he humiliated her publicly. Sabrina's breathing quickened. She quietly stepped backward toward the side exit. Grace noticed immediately. So did Claire. Without raising her voice, Claire turned toward her. "Ms. Vale," she said calmly, "you are named in the financial evidence." Sabrina's hand froze on the ballroom door handle. Slowly, every eye in the room turned toward her next. Preston looked at Sabrina. For the first time, suspicion entered his face. "What evidence?" he asked. Sabrina's lips parted, but no confident answer came out. Claire opened her folder. Consulting vendor transfers, draft reputation statements, internal communications regarding pressure before delivery. We will not argue those facts here tonight. That is what court is for. The word court moved through the room like thunder. Vivian gripped the back of a chair. Preston tried to recover. "This is a private family matter," he said. Arthur looked around the ballroom. At 11:47 p.m. outside that gate, when you allowed people to record your pregnant wife on the ground, you made it public. The room went silent again. Grace looked at Preston. For the first time, he did not look like the man who could decide her worth. He looked like a man trapped inside the consequences of his own arrogance. Nathan stepped back after service was complete. Claire turned to Grace. "We are done here." Grace nodded. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not explain herself to people who had watched her humiliation and waited to see who had more power before deciding whether she deserved sympathy. She simply turned and walked out. Arthur followed beside her. And behind them, The Bell Meridian logo still glowed across the ballroom wall like a verdict Preston could not escape. The courtroom went silent the moment the gate video began to play. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody even looked away. On the large courtroom screen, Grace Whitman appeared sitting outside the mansion gate, pregnant and shaking in the cold night air while party lights glowed behind iron bars. Then Vivian Whitman's voice echoed clearly through the room. "Let her stay there. Maybe the cold will teach her where women like her belong." A second later, Sabrina Vale's voice followed. "You're already embarrassing the baby." Then came Preston Whitman's voice. "You came into my life with nothing, Grace. Tonight, you leave with nothing." The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old pregnant wife Preston publicly humiliated, sat calmly beside her lawyer with both hands folded tightly over her stomach. She did not look at Preston. That mattered, because her silence carried more dignity than his excuses ever could. Across the courtroom, Preston Whitman, the 36-year-old founder of Whitman Strategic, sat stiffly beside his attorneys. His expensive suit still looked perfect, but his confidence was finally beginning to crack. Beside him sat Sabrina Vale, the 31-year-old mistress who helped Preston manipulate both Grace and the company finances. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sabrina no longer looked superior. She looked afraid. Judge Helen Morris, a 58-year-old family court judge responsible for deciding the divorce, financial protection requests, and evidence disputes, watched the screen carefully without expression. Judge Morris mattered because every lie Preston built was now collapsing directly in front of someone who could turn truth into orders. Claire Monroe, the 45-year-old divorce attorney fighting for Grace, stood slowly once the video ended. "Your Honor," Claire said calmly, "this case is not about one emotional argument between spouses. It is about a deliberate campaign of isolation, financial pressure, reputation destruction, and abandonment." Claire approached the evidence table. One controlled explosion after another began. First came the marriage evidence. Claire presented old emails from the early years of Whitman Strategic. Preston's own messages described Grace as the mind behind the numbers. Early company drafts listed Grace as a strategic contributor to compliance and financial planning. Grace's chest tightened painfully seeing those old messages again. Because years ago, Preston loved her intelligence. Now he punished her for remembering his weakness. Flashbacks flickered through Grace's mind. The tiny office. Cold coffee at midnight. Preston asleep at his desk while she corrected financial reports to save his company. Back then, they were partners. Now he sat across the courtroom pretending she contributed nothing. Claire turned toward Preston calmly. "So when Mr. Whitman publicly claimed he built his company alone," she asked, "that statement ignored documented contributions from his wife?" Preston's jaw tightened. His attorney touched his arm before he could answer. Then Claire introduced the domestic cruelty evidence. The nursery footage appeared next. The courtroom watched Preston pressure Grace to sign the postnuptial agreement while visibly pregnant. Then Sabrina grabbing the flash drive. Then Vivian ordering Grace's belongings packed. Mara Lewis, the 44-year-old housekeeper who secretly saved the footage, testified next. Her hands trembled while speaking, but her voice stayed honest. "Mrs. Whitman never screamed," Mara whispered. "She mostly stayed quiet. That was the saddest part." Vivian looked furious hearing it. Then Owen Pike, the 38-year-old security guard who locked Grace outside the mansion gate, took the stand. Owen looked ashamed. "Mr. Whitman ordered me to disable Mrs. Whitman's gate access," he admitted quietly. "He told me not to interfere after she was outside." Grace closed her eyes briefly. Hearing it publicly somehow hurt differently. The hospital records followed. Medical documents confirmed Grace arrived at the emergency room distressed, without transportation, without phone access, without bank access, and without emergency support while 7 months pregnant. Judge Morris's face hardened slightly. Then came the financial evidence. Derek Shaw, the 41-year-old chief financial officer who helped expose Preston's fraud, stepped forward carrying accounting files. Derek explained the fake consulting vendors connected to Sabrina. Wire transfers, shell companies, hidden payments. Then Claire displayed the emails. One message from Sabrina appeared clearly on the courtroom screen. Pressure her before delivery. A wife with a child has stronger sympathy in court. A wave of whispers moved through the courtroom. Sabrina immediately shook her head. Preston manipulated me, she said quickly. He controlled everything. Claire calmly opened another folder. Then she displayed a second message written by Sabrina herself. Make her look unstable before she makes you look guilty. This time, even the judge's expression changed. Sabrina's face drained of color. Because now she was no longer just the mistress. She was part of the plan. Then Claire carefully shifted toward the final truth. The hidden identity evidence. Arthur Bell, the 70-year-old founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, and the man who found Grace outside the mansion gate, sat quietly behind Grace throughout the hearing. Not as her savior. As family. Claire presented sealed birth records first. Then alias documentation connecting Lillian Harper to Lillian Bell. Then preliminary DNA confirmation from a court-approved laboratory. The courtroom became completely still again. Evidence currently supports, Claire said carefully, that Grace Whitman is the biological granddaughter of Arthur Bell. Grace stopped breathing for a moment. Even though she suspected it already, hearing it spoken officially changed something deep inside her. Suddenly, her mother's silence made sense. Lillian had not hidden because she was ashamed. She hid because she was protecting her daughter. Grace remembered her mother burning letters at the kitchen sink while crying softly. We are surviving until truth is safe. Arthur's eyes filled with tears quietly behind her. But he stayed silent. He respected Grace's moment. Across the room, Vivian looked frozen. The woman she mocked for being low class carried the bloodline of the very billionaire family Preston spent years begging for approval from. And Preston finally understood the full weight of what he had destroyed. Not because Grace suddenly became valuable. Because she had always been valuable. He was simply too selfish to see it. Judge Morris finally spoke. The court grants the dissolution of marriage. Grace exhaled shakily. The court also grants emergency financial protection, temporary support, asset preservation orders, and an evidence preservation order covering marital assets, business records, estate surveillance, and communications relevant to these proceedings. The words hit Preston like falling concrete. Judge Morris continued. Given the evidence presented, this court also refers the financial materials to the appropriate investigative authorities. Preston's attorney closed his eyes. Sabrina looked at Preston as if he had become a sinking ship. At that same moment, outside the family court process, Bell Meridian formally paused all financing discussions with Whitman Strategic under leadership conduct and financial integrity clauses. Within hours, other investors followed. Preston's company began collapsing before court even ended. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. Cameras flashed wildly. One reporter shouted towards Sabrina, "Do you stand by Preston Whitman?" Sabrina froze for only a second. Then she said coldly, "I was misled." Preston stared at her in disbelief. But Sabrina simply entered a waiting car and drove away without looking back. The woman he betrayed, Grace, for abandoned him publicly the moment he became dangerous to her future. Grace watched silently. No victory smile. No celebration. Only exhaustion. Then suddenly, Preston pushed through the reporters. "Grace." She turned slowly. For the first time in months, Preston looked genuinely broken. Not powerful. Not polished. Broken. "You should have told me who you were," he said desperately. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered quietly, "You should have known who I was before you knew what I was worth." The reporters went silent for half a second. Then the cameras flashed again. Grace turned away from Preston and walked toward Arthur's old yellow taxi. Arthur opened the door for her without saying a word. Behind Preston, reporters continued shouting questions while the empire he built on image started collapsing in real time. The gate opened the moment Grace Whitman's car stopped in front of the mansion. The sound alone almost broke her. Months earlier, that same iron gate locked behind her while she sat outside, pregnant, humiliated, and abandoned in the cold night air. Now it opened automatically. Not because Preston welcomed her. Because the court ordered him to. Grace Whitman, the 31-year-old woman Preston Whitman once tried to erase, sat quietly in the back seat of Arthur Bell's old yellow taxi with a folded baby blanket resting across her lap. Morning sunlight touched the mansion walls softly, but the house no longer looked powerful. It looked empty. No music. No wealthy guests. No laughter floating through the windows. Only silence. Arthur Bell, the 70-year-old billionaire founder of Bell Meridian Holdings, who first appeared to Grace as a simple taxi driver, stepped out first and opened the door for her gently. He could have arrived in luxury cars now. But he chose the taxi. Because the taxi had become something sacred between them. It was the place where Grace stopped being abandoned and started being found. Claire Monroe, the 45-year-old divorce attorney who helped Grace destroy Preston's control legally, stood waiting beside the gate with several folders tucked under her arm. "We'll make this quick," Claire said softly. Grace nodded. She had not returned to the mansion to reclaim the marriage. Only the final pieces of herself. As Grace stepped onto the driveway, memories hit her immediately. Preston carrying her through the front doors after their honeymoon. The nursery walls half-painted. The night she sat outside those same gates, begging herself not to collapse. Her chest tightened briefly. But this time, she kept walking. Inside the mansion, the damage was impossible to hide. Furniture had been removed. Staff numbers were smaller. The air itself felt colder. Whitman's strategic was under investigation. Bell Meridian financing was gone. Investors had pulled back within days after court. Sabrina had begun cooperating through her attorneys to protect herself. Vivian's social circle disappeared almost overnight once the scandal became public. Everything Preston built around image had collapsed with the image itself. Vivian Whitman appeared first at the top of the staircase. Vivian, the 62-year-old woman who once mocked Grace for being ordinary blood, stopped moving the second she saw her. For the first time since Grace entered the Whitman family, Vivian looked unsure of herself. Because now she knew. Grace was not the weak outsider she had insulted for years. She was part of the Bell family. Vivian opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out. Grace did not stop walking. That silence became Vivian's punishment. Near the hallway, Mara Lewis hurried forward emotionally. Mara, the 44-year-old housekeeper who secretly protected Grace when nobody else did, wrapped her arms around Grace carefully. "You look stronger," Mara whispered tearfully. Grace smiled softly for the first time that morning. "I had to become stronger." Then Owen Pike approached slowly. Owen, the 38-year-old security guard who once locked Grace outside the gate under Preston's orders, looked deeply ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "not because things went bad for him, because what happened to you was wrong." Grace studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once. Not forgiveness, but honesty accepted. That mattered. Footsteps echoed behind them. Preston Whitman finally appeared. Grace felt the change in the room immediately. Months ago, Preston entered rooms like a king. Now he looked like a man barely holding himself together. His expensive confidence was gone, his face looked thinner, exhaustion lived in his eyes. But Grace noticed something important immediately. He still looked at her like someone who had lost property, not someone who had lost love. Preston stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he finally said quietly, "Grace, we can still fix this." Grace felt pain move through her chest unexpectedly. Because once upon a time, she would have believed him instantly. Flashbacks rose gently through her mind. A tiny office with broken lights. Preston holding her hand and promising her name would always matter beside his. Her mother whispering softly, "Names stolen from you can be returned." Arthur kneeling beside her outside the gate before he even knew who she truly was. All those memories stood beside her now. Preston stepped closer. "Think about the baby," he said desperately. "Think about everything we built." Grace slowly looked around the mansion. Everything they built. No. Everything she helped build, while Preston slowly erased her from it. Then she looked directly into his eyes. "I did think about our baby," she said calmly. "That's why I stopped letting you teach them that love looks like humiliation." The words hit Preston visibly, but he still didn't fully understand. His next sentence proved it. "I didn't know you were Arthur Bell's granddaughter." Grace stared at him quietly. Then she answered with the truth that finally destroyed him completely. "That's the only reason you're sorry." Silence crushed the room afterward. Because everybody knew she was right. If Grace had remained poor, hidden, and powerless, Preston would never have regretted what he did. Grace turned away before he could answer. And this time, Preston did not stop her. She walked upstairs to the nursery. The room was almost exactly as she had left it. Half-painted walls, unassembled crib, tiny folded baby clothes. The place where Preston tried to force her signature onto paper that would erase her. For a moment, Grace stood in the doorway. Then she crossed the room and picked up the brass taxi medallion from the hospital bag. She held it in her palm. The old metal was warm from her skin. Arthur appeared quietly behind her, but did not enter until she nodded. "My daughter would have loved you," he said softly. Grace looked down. "She did love me," she whispered. "She just had to love me in hiding." Arthur's eyes filled. Grace turned toward him. "I don't want my child raised around secrets." Arthur nodded slowly. "Then we build something different." Grace packed only what mattered. Her mother's letters, the baby blanket, the ultrasound envelope, the 7 printed pages that started the legal fight, and the medallion. Everything else could stay behind. Outside, Arthur waited beside the old yellow taxi patiently. Grace carried the small baby blanket against her chest as she walked toward it. not as a victim leaving ruins behind, as a woman leaving captivity behind. Arthur opened the door gently. Before getting in, Grace looked back once at the mansion gate. The same gate that once locked her out, now standing open behind her. Then the story moved forward. Months later, Grace Bell Harper stood on a stage inside a Bell Meridian Foundation event, holding her baby while cameras flashed warmly around her. She no longer used Whitman as the name that defined her. Legally, she had restored Harper for her mother and accepted Bell for the truth her mother had hidden. She was no longer hiding. She had become the director of a new foundation, helping pregnant women facing financial abuse, legal intimidation, and abandonment. She also returned to financial compliance work, helping expose hidden fraud inside companies that silenced vulnerable people. Arthur introduced her proudly that evening. "My granddaughter," he said warmly, "Grace Bell Harper, the woman who survived the gate and opened doors for others." The audience applauded. Grace stepped toward the microphone slowly. The brass taxi medallion rested beside her notes. She touched it gently before speaking. "Some gates are built to keep people out," she said softly, "but sometimes they only prove who was never meant to stay trapped inside." And somewhere far away, inside an empty mansion filled with silence, Preston Whitman finally understood that losing Grace was the greatest failure of his life. Grace did not just survive the gate. She became the woman who opened doors for others. Preston lost the mansion, the money, the mistress, and the respect he worshipped. But Grace gained something greater: her name, her child's safety, her dignity, and the truth her mother had hidden to protect her. In the end, the old taxi did not carry a helpless woman away from shame. It carried a woman back to herself. If this story touched you, like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional stories where betrayal meets justice and the forgotten finally rise.